Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Let's see if we can. Good morning. Thank you, James. How's that? Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Can you hear me okay? Great. Welcome to the Nature Positive Hub for a conversation around how we can unlock the catalytic potential of private finance to accelerate a net zero nature positive future. I'm Melanie Jameson, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions for COP27 and COP28. We've got some thought-provoking conversations lined up for you today to really explore how can we rewire the financial system so that we can harness the power of nature to solve the climate and biodiversity crises. But before we start, I just want to recognize the incredible experience and talent in the room. We've got leaders here today from business, from finance, from government, and from civil society. And I just really want to appreciate you making the time to be here this morning. And I hope that you get the chance to connect and have some really productive conversations afterwards. Now, this morning, we're going to start by anchoring the discussion in the science and really focusing on the role that nature can play in tackling the impacts we're facing, having crossed several planetary boundaries. And then we're going to look at the financial system, and we're going to hear what's required to align capital with nature and climate goals. We'll also hear some inspiring examples of how private finance is enabling credible nature-based solutions that support both the environment and local communities. And finally, we'll close by really looking at the role of public finance in enabling all of this. Now, everyone here in the room is very clear on the challenges we face. We're already facing the impacts of climate change, and they're going to continue to escalate. We're destroying nature at unprecedented levels, our only home. But let's just take a moment to get really clear on the collective goals, on what we're striving towards. Investment in nature-based solutions needs to reach $484 billion by 2030. At the moment, we're at $154 billion. And that means we need to double investment in the next 2 years and triple it by 2030. Now, the opportunity for private finance in driving this investment is significant. According to the World Economic Forum, it's estimated that scaling up nature-positive business models can unlock around $10 trillion US dollars, not trillion billion. This will also bring about social and climate benefits, including 395 million jobs. So this is an audacious goal, and one that we really need to strive towards, to build a nature-positive economy that helps to build climate resilience as well as sustainable development. So let's invite our first group of speakers to jump in with us and give their perspectives on how we reach this goal. Please join me in welcoming Johan Rockstrom, the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Eric Usher, head of United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. Hi, Eric. Great. Mary Shapiro, the vice chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And Tony Goldner, executive director on the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Come and grab a seat. And we have a very special seat reserved at the end for Her Excellency Rosanne Al-Mubarak, who of course is president of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as well as the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP28. She is on her way in the traffic from one other meeting to here. So when she comes in, we'll give her a warm welcome, but we're going to start our conversation. And I'm just going to share a little bit to frame the discussion. And of course, the UN Climate Champions today have launched a report. It's called Mobilizing Private Capital for Nature to Meet Climate and Nature Goals. And I just want to take a moment to share 6 actions that are outlined in that report. And I'd like to use that as a context for our conversation before we jump in. So I'm just going to read those 6 points. And the first is to adopt high integrity science-based targets and disclosure frameworks. You can see them here on the screen. You can also see the QR code, which will pop up at the end so you can download the report. The second is to integrate adaptation and resilience into business and investment strategies. The third is to collect and share high quality nature data and analytics. The fourth is to scale catalytic initiatives that accelerate nature positive business models. Fifth is to work with governments, development finance banks, and philanthropies to catalyze more private capital for nature-based solutions. And finally, it's really to share best practices, lessons, and success stories to enable greater public and private finance. So that's the summary of the report, and we're going to hear Roseanne share a little bit more of that when she joins. But Johan, I wanted to start our conversation with you. And of course, through the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, you've really set out a path very clearly on where we need to be by 2030. And I'd love to ask you today to really bring to life for us the role that nature-based solutions play in helping us get there. And within that, what is the role of finance?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie, and good morning, everyone. So, as you may have seen, we've just released the third scientific update on the planetary boundary science, showing that 6 of the 9 boundaries are now outside of the safe operating space. And this is a warning sign that is now corroborated by the IPCC, showing that we will fail on delivering on climate unless we get it right on the biosphere resilience. And this is a very dramatic moment. Actually, IPCC even quantifies this to up to 50% of intact nature is a prerequisite for us to have a chance of holding the 1.5 degrees Celsius mark. And the planetary boundary science now confirms this. The Earth Commission worked for 3 years to further confirm this. So we have like unequivocal scientific evidence coming from so many sources that without nature-based solutions, we cannot talk about a Paris Agreement having any chance of delivery, even if we would actually follow the carbon law of phasing out fossil fuels, which we know that we're not following. So we're kind of doing a double error where we're both continuing to risk the climate forcing from fossil fuel burning and losing the stability and resilience in the biosphere of the Earth system. That's the situation we're in right now. So therefore, we need to ramp up in an unprecedented way. And when we analyze this, which of course most of you are so well aware of, we distinguish between the intact nature and the managed nature agenda. And the intact nature is in a way quite straightforward. It's about protecting and conserving the carbon sinks and the fundamental capacity of intact nature to keep the Earth system stable. But managed nature, I think, is where we need to really accelerate the nature-based solution investments. And that's where so much of the potential lies of really getting to the gigaton level of carbon sequestration and reliable long-term preservation of that carbon over time. How to unleash that finance, finally, I think that is still a major question for us, because we're seeing increasingly that many companies misuse the whole concept of offsetting as a way of slowing their pathway to phase out fossil fuels. So how do we create really stringent and robust mechanisms, I think, is one of the challenges to discuss here. But I think your point about the quantities is right. We have to come to the $1 trillion level if we are going to have any chance of getting this right. The good news is that the solutions are there. It's not some theory of how we can straighten and transition back to a safe operating space on nature. We know how to scale. We know how the solutions and practices on the ground look like. It's a question of finding the financial mechanisms for this.
Thank you, Johan. So Eric, let's build on this. And of course, your work at UNEP FI has really helped to advance the finance sector's understanding of the role they can play. And I'd love you to pick up on what Johan has said and really help us understand what are the opportunities that you're seeing in this investment, and also connected to that, what are the hurdles that we need to get over in order to make this happen?
Thanks very much. And as usual, Johan, for framing the challenge. Within the banking sector, which is our largest area of engagement, we definitely have seen an increasing awareness and need to become aware, and the TNFD has really has helped drive that. And I think the fact that the Global Biodiversity Framework learned very much from Paris and put in this notion of alignment and disclosure, I would say parties, governments have really accelerated their understanding of how best to engage the economy in addressing these global challenges. However, as has been heard, the scale of engagement is significant, or the scale of resources to be mobilized. And so a lot more needs to be done. Data, we know that's a challenge. Now, TNFD and others, we hope, will help start to fill in the data gap. And often, as we know, lack of data is used as an excuse. And yet we need to get beyond that and say, even with imperfect data, there's sufficient rationale to start at least understanding impacts and dependencies. Of course, this notion that nature, there's two sides of the coin. If we talk about climate mitigation without thinking about nature, there's no way we can do it purely from a reducing carbon point of view. We need to factor in, and if we do it today, nature can account for what, 37% of climate mitigation objective. If we wait till 2030, then it's 30, and I think 2050, then it's only 20%, as the dwindling nature stocks becomes less useful also within the climate perspective. In terms of if we frame the challenges, the first one is, we know nature capital is multifaceted. It's context specific, region specific. There's so much specificity around that. It's much harder. We don't have a simple price on carbon equivalent. But once again, not an excuse. And I think there's a requirement, and part of the role of the financial community is to start understanding the science more effectively. Traditionally, they've tried to understand the policies that are coming, but to some extent, we need to look through the policy landscape, because what's more fundamental is the science. If you can understand parts per million, if you can understand impacts and dependencies, you can start to orient your approaches to risk and to opportunity really towards on what is going to create long-term advantage. So reducing nature degradation, and then the notion of nature positive over time. Of course, enabling environment is a challenge, and nature-based solutions, we don't yet, I would say, have the scaling ability based on the current framework. So more is needed there, including from governments, for instance, in areas like payment for ecosystem services. And of course, we know this is particularly acute in emerging markets. And the third major challenge would be on blended finance, and the problem that we don't really have a standardized approach. So we have tailored solutions coming from the public side, which is useful to get started, but we need to take these to scale. And to do that, everything needs to be more standardized. So I think we need to scale up the relationship between public and private before we can scale up the flows of capital on that side.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome, Roseanne. Perfect timing. Delighted to have you. And we set off this morning, we talked a tiny little bit about the report and the 6 steps. And we've had Johan anchor us in the science and the challenge. We've had Eric take us across the landscape, the opportunities of finance, as well as the hurdles to get over. And I'd love to invite you today, Roseanne. Of course, this report is very core to the work that you do as the UN climate change high-level champion. Can you share a little bit about why it's important and what you really think we should pay attention to?
First of all, apologies. And if I say things that have already been said, just nod and all will be well. Wonderful to see so many friends in the room. And this is my second New York Climate Week. And so last year I had the great privilege to join a number of people here on the panel, where at the time it was, a real sort of calling on why is nature so absent in the climate change discourse? And why is it seen as a nice thing to do rather than a fundamental thing to do? And why is the nature community, to a certain extent, not coming in with a stronger voice and agency on what needs to happen? So as you all know, COP28 is a time when the world is going to take stock. The global stock take has been released on the 8th of September. And we know what it says, that we are far from where we need to be. And so we need to really pick and engage and increase ambition and momentum on the levers that we know exist today. And nature is one of those levers. And so the report highlights the why that we all know, but it also highlights perhaps the what and the how, which has been also very difficult because of the complexity of putting global targets on species conservation, nature, ecosystem conservation, because it's so geographically and regionally specific. So those are some of the challenges that we face. But we still face a challenge in the narrative and the discourse itself. I mean, whilst we're all here and this is a sort of nature positive event, when you go to the other climate change discourse event, it is still not as vocal and present as I believe, and I think we all share the sentiment that it needs to be. And so I think as a community, we need to, again, try to understand the why. I also agree that there's enough information, there's enough data, but we need to be very crystal clear also on the business opportunity, on the mitigation opportunity. We hear different numbers all the time. You know, nature-based solutions provide potentially a third of our mitigation requirements. Oceans provide 21% of our mitigation requirements. And so we really need to speak those numbers with confidence and ensure that that it's backed by science, and really look forward to you, Johan, and your network, as well as, of course, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, to really ensure that these numbers are really solid. And as a community, we speak those numbers with power and confidence.
Thank you, Roseanne. So, Mary, I'd love to ask you to bring to life, you know, through the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, last year, you put out a call to action on deforestation. And in that, you stated that transition plans lacking clear targets to stop and reverse deforestation are incomplete. And I'd love, you know, of course, redirecting capital from harmful activities to nature positive ones is part of addressing this deforestation risk. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of embedding nature in transition plans and what needs to be done to enable financial institutions to accelerate more of this.
Sure, I'm happy to answer that. And thank you for including me today. So I actually think that the progression from climate considerations to the broader nature considerations is a very natural progression. And I've actually been kind of pleasantly surprised that it's happened as quickly as it has. If you think back, I ran the Secretariat for the TCFD. We started in 2016. Here we are 7 years later. It's finally being incorporated into law around the world, but it's taken 7 years. And the focus on climate, on nature has actually happened much more quickly. It's become a central part of the discussion about how we deal with climate change much more quickly. And I think that's great. And we have to build on that momentum. The genesis of our call to action was really, I think, the rather obvious recognition that climate risk and nature risk are both financial risks, and that the financial sector has to account for those risks, that we're unlikely to reach the goals that financial institutions have set to be net zero by 2050, to make significant reductions by 2030, unless we can halt nature loss and reverse that damage, including deforestation, within this decade. So we need to address both climate and nature. They absolutely go hand in hand. I think that we are fortunate in that through the evolution of TCFD, which is now foundational in the ISSB standards, in the EU standards, and even for the SEC in the US, proposed climate disclosure rules, that we really have an opportunity to leverage that TCFD playbook for climate and make it a central part of what financial institutions are disclosing. So with the call to action by GFANZ, we have 650 financial institutions that are GFANZ members that have agreed to utilize the net zero transition plan framework that GFANZ utilized. And our expectation is that that will include addressing nature issues, that as you point out, no transition plan is complete if it fails to address deforestation and nature. And the importance of a transition plan broadly is that it takes the commitments that banks and others have made and animates them with actual actions that need to be taken to fulfill those commitments. And that will be equally true for nature as it is for climate. So as we hope to see transition plans become mandatory across the globe, just as disclosure has become mandatory, that will really accelerate the consideration of nature issues.
Thank you, Mary. So let's bring you in, Tony. I think you have something very exciting lined up tonight at the New York Stock Exchange. And, you know, I think we've talked about the complexity of the challenges that we've been facing for a number of years on this. And, you know, a lack of an aligned approach to integrate nature-related risks and opportunities in financial decision-making, I think has held a lot of that progress back. So tell us now, you know, how we're going to be equipped with the tools that we need to be able to assess, manage, and disclose risks, impacts, and dependencies for the finance sector.
Great, thanks very much, Melanie, and nice to see a number of our task force members in the room and other friends as well. Well, let me start by saying we are launching the TNFD recommendations later today, which is a great milestone, and we've had the amazing fortune of building on the foundations that Mary built at TCFD. We wouldn't, frankly, have been able to do this in the 2-year time span we've spent designing the frameworks had we not had the benefit of leveraging the TCFD structure and approach. We've also aligned the recommendations with the Global Biodiversity Framework targets and goals, because that provides us with the goalpost for 2030, which is very clear, and target 15 calls for disclosure of impacts, risks, and dependencies. So a bit like Paris, we now know what we need to do on the nature side. 200 governments, almost 200 governments have committed to those. And now with the TNFD coming out, building on the work of many other organizations over a long period of time, Natural Capital Protocol, the SASB standards, the work of IUCN and IPBES and many others, which we've sort of integrated into our approach. I think the toolbox is coming together, but just to manage expectations, TNFD is one tool in the toolbox, and we need many, many others. I wouldn't describe us as the hammer. I think that might be a bit too hard, especially as a voluntary market initiative. But I do think maybe we're the screwdriver, and we now enable people to get started with figuring out how do we take action. And I think to the question of today's panel, in my mind, there are two really big questions that we have to grapple with, or two challenges. The first is we have to fundamentally change the way business thinks about nature. And the second big challenge is who's going to pay for the resilience outcomes that Johan has talked about. I think the second question, if we can figure out answers to that question, then we can scale the finance. The money is around, but at the moment, the big money is sitting on the sidelines. Pension funds find it difficult to go through complex due diligence for anything less than $300, $400, $500 million. And the nature-based solutions that we have today, as wonderful as they are, they're much, much smaller scale. So as Johan said, we know how to scale the solution. What we don't know is how to provide the structured finance design around it to bring in the finance. And so I think TNFD can contribute to that. What we've done in the framework is we have incorporated opportunities as well as risks, dependencies as well as impacts. And while our name gets everyone very focused on disclosures and corporate reporting and compliance costs, I think what we're seeing from the discussions we've had over the last 2 years is that companies are coming towards the TNFD and embracing our work because they're not seeing it as a compliance headache. Obviously, there's a component of that which is inescapable, but this is about changing the mindset of business. We have to stop thinking about nature as a corporate social responsibility issue and start treating it as a core strategic risk management issue. And that's a huge shift. And I think one of the most powerful conversations I've had over the last 2 years was actually at Montreal, where I met one of our task force members who talked about the fact that they had pilot tested our LEAP approach, which is our assessment approach. And they had actually gone further in terms of quantifying what the potential risk to their organization was. And their nature-related risks, as a ballpark estimate, were bigger than their climate-related risks in quantitative terms. And not surprisingly, they've moved sort of consideration of nature is now under the CFO's part of the business as a risk management issue. And I think if we can start to see that happening at scale, we can address the first of those two questions. And then we have to figure out who's going to pay for the outcomes that we all need. Because at the end of the day, the cash flows of business rely on the flows of nature's benefits into our business models. We won't have the first if we trash the second. And that's exactly the path that we're heading down now. So we've got a lot of work to do.
We do, Tony. And I'm wondering if we can use that as a springboard for a final comment from each of our speakers. And of course, we have this big red clock where you're aware of how much time we have left. And I'd love to ask you each to share, 8 or 10 words, very brief. We have an audience here that have really chosen at the start of New York Climate Week on a wet Monday morning to be here because they care about this conversation. What would you say to them as they go out and have conversations and back into their work and speak with colleagues and leaders? What message would you like them to carry? What action would you like them to focus on? And Johan, if you don't mind, I'll pick on you first and we'll go in the same order that we spoke down that way and then back to Mary and Tony.
Yeah, I'd like to combine Razan's point about power and confidence and Eric's point about operationalizing. I mean, the remaining carbon budget for a safe landing on the fossil fuels are only 250 gigatons. That's 6 years of emissions. So I think we in the nature community have a very powerful double message that is really scientifically based. There's no escaping to decarbonize the world economy faster than ever because the remaining carbon budget is so small. But we want to have an orderly landing. We don't want to crash the global economy. We don't want to crash livelihoods and the inability for development, particularly among the most vulnerable in the world. So nature will save us. Nature is the only path for a safe landing because that's where the untapped potential is to start rebuilding. Nature positive, I think the key word there is positive because positive means rebuilding. It means building up more of that currency that keeps the Earth system resilient, and we can do it.
Thank you, Eric.
Maybe I'll follow on from that. I think we need to take a concept which has now lodged itself. Everybody knows it's an issue today. Maybe the big's different from last year and now turn it into digestible pieces, actionable pieces. It's about investing in, tomorrow's economy. And, I read the New York Times every morning here in the US. It's a charged concept broadly, but it's very clear the administration believes they're going to invest in the new economy. And I think that applies equally to nature as to climate. We need to break it down into digestible pieces and start moving forward.
Great. Razan.
I mean, we will not achieve the goals of Paris without nature. It is as simple as that. And I think we need to really reverberate this message time and time again. We now have the tools. You're right, they may not be perfect, but they are there to help the community engage with the business sector and the financial sector to help unlock needed finance. But what's also important is when you talk about nature, it's nature positive and it's nature in the context also of a world that is also developing. Nature positive work needs to also be seen within a development agenda. It needs to be seen within a lives and livelihood agenda. When we want to protect the world's largest carbon sinks, we need to also understand the context by which those carbon sinks exist. So really position nature as exactly as the champion, but also as a tool really for green development.
Thanks, Razan. Mary.
1 second.
I'm going to take a minute out of the next bit. It's okay. I'm on it.
I think we have a moral and societal obligation.
Mary.
But we also have a really compelling economic argument for nature positive.
I know we're on borrowed time. I think we need to learn the lessons of how we have scaled investment in infrastructure. Toll roads is a good example. We need to invest in nature like it's infrastructure. We know how to do that. Public-private partnerships, it's a bit of a dirty word now. We now talk about blended finance, but governments have been paying for productivity outcomes in their economies by building toll roads to move things around the economy faster. That's an outcome that they're willing to pay for. They should be willing to pay for preserving and building back the resilience of nature. And then we can bring in all the private finance that's sitting there on the sidelines today. So nature is infrastructure.
Wonderful. Please give our wonderful speakers a big hand. Roseanne, Eric, Johan, Mary, and Tony. Thank you. So today's conversation really builds off a conversation that we had earlier this year at London Climate Action Week. And we're delighted that we've also got some of the speakers from that session here today. And we wanted to share just a short video to share some of the main themes and outcomes that came out from that discussion. We might need to have the audio. Is there a way, James, to get the, we're giving that a go. Maybe what I can do while we wait for the audio to work, we were going to do this after the video. Let's do it now. I mentioned the sort of incredible experience and wisdom we've got in the room, and I want to give you 3 minutes each, 3 minutes, actually 90 seconds each, to just turn to somebody in the room that you don't know, hopefully where you don't need to move your seat, or maybe you don't know them that well. And I'm just going to ask you to briefly answer 2 questions. Say your name, your organization, and answer 2 questions. And the first is, why did you choose to be here? You guys have got super busy diaries, so it's really interesting to think about why you chose this conversation this morning. And the second thing is, what struck you from the conversation so far? You've got 90 seconds each. I'll let you know when it's time to swap. I'll ring a little bell, and then you'll swap. And then hopefully we'll have our audio for the video ready. Okay, find somebody. If it needs to be a trio, it's fine. We got the audio?
Yeah, they're figuring it out. He just put on the clock. Now it's giving you a little bit too much time. So I'll signal to how much time it was.
Yeah.
But I got him to focus on the video instead.
Yeah, great. Maud, what would be good to know is the absolute hard stop that has to be out the room, because I think that the Rene's kind of shorter.
Yeah, exactly. We're clear on that. Yeah.
And then hopefully we can adjust the clock. I don't think we can shorten any edits.
No, I agree. Yeah,
You know,
it's 30 minutes.
yeah.
We're not too bad. So like 9:55. I'm gonna go check on the video. I think they'll probably be at like 7 minutes behind, which I think we can like catch up on.
Yeah.
So we may also make a call. I'm gonna go ask them like we have to cut the video.
Okay, time to swap. Swap for the other person.
They say the video should work, and it's 3:50, basically 4 minutes.
Okay. So I might just ring the bell, and then I think you just start the video and they'll quiet
I'll
down.
just get them ready.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll do it in 1 minute when the bell rings.
For instance, insurance is going to be a very difficult business. At a 4-degree world, there is not going to be an insurance business. California homeowners already find it impossible to find housing insurance because of the risk of wildfires. It's a complicated situation, but that's the bottom line. I hope that investors and banks and the businesses that they finance understand moving into a world where they're trying to mitigate these risks that are happening right now and are going to be accelerating, that nature isn't their enemy. They need to work with nature. Nature and climate are two sides of the same coin. Fixing for climate and fixing for nature can go hand in hand. Nature is the best friend we have. The oceans absorb huge amounts of heat and carbon. We need to protect forests. We need to restore soil and peat bogs and other natural carbon sinks. So we need to do both at the same time.
We have to connect our climate and nature objective with the economy. Now it is not because just an agreement, the Paris Agreement or the Global Biodiversity Framework, that for sure are two fantastic pieces, but also it is more because of the economy. So we could keep our development. We can grow if we are able to be climate and nature responsible.
Because there are these market failures that undermine the alignment of markets with the transition, we need to advocate that governments and regulators who can fix those market failures so that we get that balance of us doing our bit, but actually having the enabling environment from regulators and governments.
The launch of the 5th P handbook by Race to Zero is so important. The 5th P is about persuasion. It talks about how we need to align our advocacy plans and our policy messages around the Race to Zero.
And it's complex. We know the issue is far from a simple one, but it is a global issue, and we did that before. So when we had the ozone layer problem, we did the Montreal Protocol, we set targets for each and every country, we apply, and now the ozone layer is being recovered. So it's for us now to replicate what we did before with two other topics. One is global emissions, which is fundamental and must be tackled.
Tom and others have enjoyed hearing their voices do that. Okay, so we're going to jump into our next conversation to really focus on delivering financial solutions to address nature-related risks and tap into the big investment opportunity of addressing both climate and nature goals together. And to do this, I'm delighted to welcome our next moderator, Daniela Carrera, Head of Finance Sector Engagement of the Tropical Forest Alliance at the World Economic Forum. And we're going to invite the speakers to join us: Tom Taylor, Head of Climate Finance, Aviva Investors; Jennifer Tauli-Kapuz, Global Policy and Advocacy Lead of Neotero; and Simon Young, Senior Director at Willis Towers Watson Insurance Development Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I think it became very clear this morning that there is no climate without nature, there is no nature without climate. We heard a lot as well about the huge progress that we have done over the past few years with TNFD, great lessons learned from TCFD, that's really, really important. And I think I'm really pleased to be sitting here with the leading financial institutions which are trying to put all that we heard this morning into practice. So I'm not going to talk too much. I'm going to give directly the word for Thomas. So Aviva is part of an initiative which is called Financial Sector Deforestation Action, FSDA, where a group of nearly 40 investors committed to have portfolios free of deforestation and conversion by 2025. They're doing their best efforts, but also to redirect finance for nature-based solutions. Can you tell a little bit about what this group and yourself, of course, is doing to mitigate these risks and identify these opportunities?
Thank you. And yeah, just delighted to be here on this panel. Yeah, absolutely. So in 2021, in the build up to COP26 in Glasgow, we came together. We worked with the climate champions, with DEFRA, with other financial institutions to make this commitment to eliminate, on our best efforts basis, eliminate commodity-driven deforestation from our portfolios. And one of the things about that commitment was the way that it brought together the financial sector, the real economy, and all part of how we get this working. And there are a number of things that we've done in the time since then, just to try to sort of make this practical and embed it across our work, both on the investment side and on the underwriting side. So that community is engaging with other investors and with companies to try and encourage them to eliminate that commodity driven deforestation, and we're co-leading engagement with 5 companies and 5 banks on those issues. We have reviewed our portfolios and we heard about data and the problems of data, but it's really important that we don't use that as an excuse. So, you know, embedded all the way back in the Rio Declaration over 30 years ago, the idea of the precautionary principle that we don't wait for data because we know there are risks. And there are data sets out there. So we've had to sort of cross-pollinate, if you like, across data sets from CDP, from Forest 500, the spot indicators from the Zoological Society of London, Global Forest Watch, and that's allowed us to start to assess our portfolios and find out where the biggest risks are and focus our engagement on where the biggest risks are. Obviously, today is a big day for TNFD, which is really exciting, and the acceleration that we've seen following in the footsteps of TCFD is really exciting. Every year, our investment CEO writes to over 1,500 companies that we invest in with our priorities for engagement. And one of those was on TNFD, saying, use that LEAP framework. So even before the official launch, make sure that you're looking across your business and thinking about where your risks are, because we're going to be engaging with you on those issues, and we're encouraging people to take up TNFD. We've also built that not just into engagement with companies, but to engagement with countries because of the role that countries can play. So again, every year we write to finance ministers and central bank governors from the biggest sovereign issuers that we invest in. And we said this year, looking back to the success at Montreal, we said, we want to see policy to embed that framework that you've signed up to. We want to see you embed nature positivity across government. And put that hand in hand with also doing more on climate and enhancing NDCs and policy to implement those. And we were, that coming Montreal framework, we spent 2 years working with across the civil society and with other investors to really push for that financial flows target 14. So important, again, learning from Paris to align financial flows, and that's going to take policy action. We're going to need to see it the economic benefits of nature be reflected in valuations and assessments by companies. And then we're also doing it in investment. We're looking at investment in nature-based solutions. We've got particularly in Scotland an area of 6,300 hectares, which is being afforested and restoring peat bogs, which is going to capture millions of tons of carbon over the life cycle of the program. So it's about using all the spheres of influence we have, all the levers we've got, and encouraging other people to do the same.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So, Jennifer, we heard here that is really important that like we hear a lot, just transition for climate. We need a just transition for nature as well. We need to bring everyone together, but just not bring everyone together, to involve everyone that is relevant and important to this discussion. Indigenous peoples, they play a huge role in this entire conversation about investment in nature-based solutions. How can we bring the voices of the indigenous peoples for climate leadership, and what's happening already?
Yes, yeah, when you were saying that this panel is composed mostly of people from the financial sector, I was like, maybe do I belong here? but you know, indigenous peoples are more consciously being included in the different spaces where we talk about nature and climate. You know, increasingly. So, and I think it's because there's also a recognition that is science-backed that most of nature now, when we talk about intact nature, it's indigenous peoples that take care or that are stewards of these places. More than 30% of the world's land, and there's no exact data on oceans, but a huge proportion of intact places in the world are managed and stewarded by indigenous peoples. Therefore, it's important for us to be part of it. Now, when we talk about prioritizing and looking for the potentials, you know, of course, managed places have huge potential, but we have to recognize that intact nature, places where nature is intact, there are also threats and risks that are at play in our territories. We talk about transition, and there is a race, of course, to mine minerals that would fuel, that would be part of our electric batteries. And what we are seeing in indigenous territories is that there's an increasing tendency to overlook safeguards for indigenous peoples in the race towards transition. So we have partners, for example, in Argentina, where there is nickel mining, lithium mining, and all of the safeguards have been removed in policy, and we cannot continue this way, because if we undermine the position of indigenous peoples who are taking care of these places that we value, then we undermine the integrity of these different places. Now, the reason why I'm here is because when we look at public finance, only 1% goes to indigenous peoples who take care of more than 30% of the land, of the global land, and also have more than 80% of the biodiversity. So this is inequity for us, and we don't want it to be repeated when it comes to finance from the private sector.
So yeah, you must be here. See, not that you should be here, you must be in all of this discussion. It's really, really important to hear. And I think that we're talking about bringing the knowledge as well, isn't it? There's so much there to share. No, thank you very much. So next one, Simon, insurance. We are seeing already so many disasters, you know, immediately. I remember when I used to work on this agenda 15 years ago, we would say, that is a long-term problem. Investors need to start thinking a little bit long-term. It's here already. It's no long-term anymore. It's short. It's happening. How is insurance playing its role?
Thanks, Daniela, and thanks very much for the invite to be here. So almost everybody on the previous panel and on this panel has talked about risk, and insurance is about identifying risk and then managing risk, or helping to manage risk. And so there's two main areas where I think we've been making progress, can make a lot more progress. One is understanding the risk, particularly to nature. The insurance industry over the last 30 years or so has got pretty good at understanding risk in the context of the built environment, of buildings, infrastructure, businesses, the way businesses run, but not so much nature. So I think that's an area where we've been making some progress, but we need to make a lot more progress, because unless you quantify the risk that is being faced, in financial terms, then investment is very difficult, and other things have to fall behind the understanding of the risk in the first place. You can't manage it effectively unless you understand it. But the second piece is developing tools and products that can actually service those risk management needs. And I've been working quite a bit over the last few years on actual practical tools, and I'll very quickly highlight three here. One is we've designed an insurance program, an insurance policy that responds to hurricanes on the Mesoamerican reef off of Central America. Responds very, very quickly. So it's almost as soon as a hurricane goes over a portion of the reef, payout can be made, and that funds a response mechanism, which gets people onto the reef. They take off debris off the reef, they reattach coral heads. The more action you can take in the first 60 days, there's a massive benefit to the recovery rate of the reef, and therefore it can get back to providing the services that it's providing to the local communities in terms of fisheries, tourism, and protection. So that's one area. Another area in Fiji, we've been working with the government to develop some use cases for insurance for the businesses, the small businesses they're investing in through their blue bond, or the future blue bond hasn't been issued yet. And so, these sorts of tools aren't generally available. You can't go into your local insurance broker and buy a protection for your business that relies on diving on the reef or sailing trips out to see nature, and various other businesses so kind of underpinning the development of these small businesses, which is going to form the blue economy in Fiji and other small island developing states. So thinking about how we can bring new insurance products to the market. And then the third one is at the macro scale, where we put in place a protection for the repayment by the government of Belize of its blue bond, which was through which it restructured all of its private sector debt a couple of years ago. And so that brings sustainability to that whole entire program, because if Belize gets hit by a big hurricane, the next debt repayment is made by the insurance payout. So the Belize government doesn't have to worry about it. It brings sustainability to that program and to the investment that it's making, and to the to Belize's credit rating, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of underpins the whole of Belize's efforts to invest in nature and the blue economy.
Yeah, it's working. So no, thank you very, very much. So I think we've heard some good examples of what's happening, what's not happening as well, what needs to happen more. I think everyone here is aware, everyone knows the importance of the agenda. We have a number of projects available. However, we heard also this morning, these projects are small, due diligence process is very complex. So we need to scale. We need to scale them very, very, very fast. So capital markets, they can become something that is investable from a capital markets perspective as well. So Tom, how is Aviva trying to reorient finance to these nature-based solutions and to support this agenda, this transition?
So I think, as we've heard a lot of times this morning, one thing is not to think of climate and nature as separate, and to very consciously make sure that when we're dealing with one, we're thinking about the other, partly to avoid unintended consequences, but partly because there are reinforcing and positive consequences as well when we try and do both together. And in terms of scaling markets, ultimately, the scale of markets and the power of markets to drive the global economy, we need to make sure that the fundamentals that drive markets, so the valuation of corporate activity, takes account of climate and nature outcomes. So we need to value nature as a public good better, and we need to make sure that the negative externalities, so not just carbon, but impact on nature, are brought into the way that corporate cash flows and valuations and balance sheets and accounting, all those things that the analysts in banks, insurers, investors take into account in working out what a company's worth. We need to make sure that is aligned, because if not, we're asking for finance flows to align with the protection and restoration of nature. We're asking for finance flows to align with the goals of Paris, but you can't just do that because it's the right thing to do. You've got to make sure that we actually take action to align the economy with that. So that means that everybody needs to play their part. And I think in the stock take synthesis that Razan mentioned, I think it was great to see reference to a whole of government, whole of society response to these issues. Same goes for nature. And I think that means that everyone has to play their part. So governments have to play their part. We need nature positive climate transition plans from governments that markets believe, so that the policy signals are actually believed by the markets. We need the same, which is starting to come through with transition planning in the private sector. And we need everybody as citizens to hold their governments to account for this and to say, I care about this. And if you don't do your job, I'm going to find leaders that will.
Thank you. There we go. Elections coming, lots of places. Vote consciously. So again, I think it's a very similar question to you to know how can we actually bring these voices together, scale and speed that we need.
I think the Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the Convention on Biological Diversity, but at climate change as well. But Indigenous activists, we were very pleased when TNFD very consciously reached out to us and engaged with us. Because when we talk about nature, it was precisely this recognition that we don't just talk about nature as though it's just there. It's also being taken care of by communities, by Indigenous peoples. And so when we had a discussion with them, we very clearly said that we don't just disclose dependencies, impacts, and risks on nature, but also on those that take care of nature. So we have to identify if there are Indigenous peoples in the place, if there are impacts on Indigenous peoples and their rights, and there are impacts on how they manage as they have done for tens of thousands of years, no? So, but beyond looking at Indigenous peoples as, just a safeguard and due diligence issue, I think what you said earlier about the knowledge of Indigenous peoples contributing to this work is very important. So we are not just, part of a tick box that we need to comply with in order to get to the solution to the problem that we have. In fact, Indigenous peoples also hold the solution. No, we're not a barrier towards getting the solution. We hold the solution. And so we are very willing to contribute our traditional knowledge to climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation. However, we also are in need of resources to address the risks that are coming to our communities. And so it's necessary to find or develop mechanisms that would deliver resources directly to Indigenous peoples. We had the 1.7 billion IPLC pledge at COP26. The last report that was provided by that group said that 19% has been disbursed. However, it goes to big international NGOs or local NGOs and not directly to Indigenous peoples. And maybe the message I want to say now is that a lot of Indigenous organizations have the capacity to absorb these kinds of resources and are capable of putting it in the right places. So just very briefly, an example would be our partner in Indonesia, Aman, that has absorbed money directly from the Norwegians, from NICFI, the forest facility. And through their efforts, they have now encouraged young people to go back to the community. And in that way, traditional knowledge gets transmitted to the next generation. And we ensure that the values that Indigenous peoples hold are, persist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is very, very inspiring to hear. And I think it's a really important message to give to everyone here. I think the several intermediaries sometimes in the middle of the way, it can delay the process. And again, I think that there is an urgency here. And I think we all together here have to find solutions in order to tackle exactly this type of issues that we are having now. And how can we mainstream this conversation? How can we make everyone outside this room here, because everyone here is a believer that we need to act now, but how can we pass this message outside and mainstream this conversation as well, and this important message that we are hearing? And I'm going to ask the same question to you: scale, speed. What do we need?
So insurers are not only provide protection for investors, but they are also obviously investors themselves. And so I think on the investment side, insurers inherently, I think, understand the longer term problems, issues, climate risk, nature risk, because the other side of their balance sheet is dealing with that on a day-to-day basis, and already have many of the tools that we need to fully understand and quantify that. So I definitely see that scaling up on the asset side of insurers is possible. We've seen that to some extent on the climate, and I think on nature we're also starting to see it as well. So I think that's really important to across the investor universe, that kind of insurers are particularly targeted, if you like, as partners, because I think that they have a natural tendency to be forward-looking and forward-leaning on this. On the protection side, I'm a little bit cautious in kind of urging scaling up of insurance, because insurance needs to be scaling up in but behind the scaling up of the finance itself. Insurance can't lead that scaling up. It needs to be there to support that scaling up. And I've seen in a few cases where more insurance protection is seen inherently as better, and that's not necessarily the case. I think we have to be cautious about making sure that we're using insurance judiciously. But certainly, a traditional investor will want to tick the insurance box, the risk management box, the practical financial risk management box, where that's and where risk transfer insurance can be a cost-effective way of doing that. Then those products need to be available from the insurance side, and both available and known about as well. And I think that that's another issue that we're facing a little bit, is that some of these kind of more newer innovative investments in nature, it's little bit difficult to see where the insurance kind of product, insurance protection might come from, and I think we from the insurance side need to do a better job of making it clear that we can develop these tools. There is innovation in the insurance industry. It is relatively conservative, I think, on the whole. It's been around quite a long time and hasn't necessarily moved particularly quickly, but there is capacity for innovation, and I think we need to do a job ourselves in making sure that we're doing that innovation in combination with and in collaboration with both the public side and the private side of blended finance, to make sure that those tools and products are available when that scaling up is happening.
So I think what I'm hearing here, that we're missing conversation across the sector. Okay, one good answer for this one already. We need to talk more to each other and get off of our bubbles, our silos. I want to give the chance for the audience to ask questions as well. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. My name is Pustar Maitar. I'm from Econosa Foundation in Indonesia. I think similar with Jennifer, yeah. I've been following this discussion since 2007 in Bali COP. Same, talking about money for nature, for indigenous people, and still no money goes directly to the indigenous community. I just want to share my experience. Last year, we revoked concession, 17 concession palm oil in Papua. The size is like 6 times of New York City. And now we are helping indigenous community to map those concessions. And just after that, nothing happened. I mean, that indigenous community is waiting for, where is the support? Where is the money for the livelihood? And some more palm oil companies coming over and offering the money. So, we are talking about nature now, but there is just no money. Yeah. we organizing commodities product from the indigenous community, shrimp and nutmeg from mangrove, and just no buyer. There is no one buying those products. So that's why I'm here. This is my first time in the New York Climate Week, and I'm come over from Papua. It's like 23 hours flight to here, just looking for where is the money for the indigenous community. So otherwise, we will repeating and repeating again of what we are saying, and just no action. So like Jennifer saying, I'm looking for those money that people talking about X billion US dollar to be in the indigenous community, and not just floating around, or just not stop in the international NGOs and nothing to the indigenous community. Thank you very much.
Thank you for. I think you got a question as well. So another one more, and then I'm gonna pick on that comment there to ask a final question for each one of you. So one more question from the audience, please.
Thank you. My name is Ezekiel, and I wanted to say thank you for a really informative panel so far. This has been really interesting. One of the things that has been coming up a lot is the need for, and this was touched on a little bit, really robust data to help evaluate everything from potential for biodiversity protection, restoration to nature risk. And another question that has also been touched upon is the responsibility that global financial institutions and business actors have towards indigenous groups and other people who live in and around areas that might be protected or invested in. There's been a lot of recent talk about how data will be marshaled and collected. There was a recent Nature Positive and Nature for Climate called for a sort of global data facility for nature-based solutions recently. And I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on how that data can be equitably shared, and respect can be shown to the people who produce that data and manage that data, and make sure that data that some groups might not want being shared is kept proprietary and not used without their consent.
Thank you. So I'm sorry, I was rushing you because the big red clock is ticking at me there, and otherwise they're not going to have time to answer your question. Do you want to answer? Anyone in the panel wants to address this question? Any thoughts?
I think that question of responsibility is really important, and we've, obviously questions of free, prior, informed consent are really important. We need to make sure whether it's around data, whether it's examples like where there are resources that are needed for transition, that they're responsibly stewarded and responsibly extracted, and that actually the benefits of that extraction is shared, right? It's not just that people come in and take it and all the profit is made in New York or in Washington or in London. That's really important too. So there's an equitable sharing. And I think making sure that these are design principles as we start to put frameworks in place, rather than fixing after the event, because actually after the event, it's too late.
Would you like to?
And building on that, yeah, exactly. Prevention is better than cure. We have to have the the legal and policy framework in place that would prevent things like that happening in the first place. So, disclosures are great, but they need to be followed up in policy. So it needs to be embedded in policy the same way that the TCFD eventually got embedded. I wanted to address the question about where is the money. The money is there, floating around. There are multilateral funds, there are bilateral funds. Now we're talking about the private sector. The problem for indigenous peoples is that the barriers to accessing those funds are so great. Can you imagine just hiring one person to manage a 25-page checklist in order to apply for a grant? That's not something that indigenous peoples can do. And then having to report every 6 weeks, providing a financial report, a narrative report, that's not something that indigenous peoples should be doing. We should be focusing on what we do best, which is stewarding the places where we are. So my call here is that when we design mechanisms for flows of private capital to go to the different places where it's needed. Let's be conscious that for indigenous peoples, we shouldn't be making it too difficult in the same way that multilaterals have been making it so difficult for indigenous peoples to access. So let's simplify it.
Thank you. Would you like to?
On the first question, I think, Tom, the point that you started with in terms of recognizing the value of nature in the macroeconomic environment is ultimately how we are able to appropriately reward the conservation of indigenous peoples of the nature that they live in and with, rather than rewarding or as being competitive and hopefully winning out against an extractive use of those resources. On the data issue, very quickly, I've worked a lot with especially with remotely sensed data, which tends to be inherently within the public domain. Most remotely sensed data is collected by government agencies, and the Europeans and the US in particular make that data very readily available. There's been some incredible advances in that technology and in that data set, and in those data sets. And I think that those are going to be the foundation of what we need to better kind of document nature, changes to nature, etc. And hopefully those can remain in the public sector, because they are global public goods, and they're really important to, as you said, to understand and to capture those for everybody's benefit.
Thank you. I think our time is up here, but I think it's a very interesting discussion. We've heard that we need to talk more, not just with each other, but across sectors as well. We heard that the money is there, but we need to redirect from north to south. We had a conversation just before this fund started, me and Thomas, that we need to bring the south together and be part of this conversation and find a way via policies and regulations that we can redirect finance from the north to the south. This is really important. Thank you all very much. I'm not going to borrow any more time. Thank you all for being here with me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've heard today that we've got a conversation going about how we direct financial flows to really meet nature and climate goals, and to make sure that they do so with speed, scale, and justice to the right people in the right communities. And we've heard that a lot of that's not happening. And we want to just take a moment before we invite our next speakers to reflect on what Tom talked about in terms of your own sphere of influence, your own levers of change. Each of you in your work, in your relationships, in your networks, has the ability to bring this message, to create some kind of greater action, to help direct those financial flows to the right people at the right place at the right time. And we're just going to take a minute before we invite our next speakers to just reflect in your own capacity. What's something that you would like to do as you leave this room? And I note that there's a bit of a shift. Probably some people have another event to go to, but if you're able to stay with us, we'd really appreciate that. And just note down either on a piece of paper or in your mind, what are you going to take away from this conversation? How can you use your influence, your networks, to support those financial flows into the right direction? And as you reflect on that, I'm going to invite our next speakers. We've got a small fireside chat moderated by Irene Suarez Perez, who is the Nature Team Lead of the Climate Champions team, and Dr. Naoko Ishii. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. And it is my true honor to introduce you all to Dr. Naoko Ishii, who is the director of the Center for Global Commons. And Dr. Naoko brings a wealth of knowledge to the discussion now that we're going to turn to focus on the role of public finance. Dr. Naoko is also a professor at the University of Tokyo. She brings also her knowledge from being a public official of the government of Japan. And also she was the chairperson and CEO of the Global Environmental Fund as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Naoko, for being here with us. So the Center for Global Commons is launching a report at COP28 on nature finance. This is a sister report to the report that we just heard about in the first panel that Her Excellency Razan was commenting on. This report on nature finance is going to focus on public policy, on policy making and public funds. Can you share a bit of your insights on your experience, but also any insights that you care to share about this report and how public finance can help unleash the potential of private capital?
Very good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for staying with us, and thank you so much for your question. Actually, there is a little bit of the history behind this and a new paper, the finance nature for finance paper. Originally, it is it is a kind of companion to Nixon, Verasonye, and Amal Bhattacharya, the high-level expert climate finance paper, which was done last year, and we will continue to do the actually follow-up paper, and it is also published at the COP28. But despite the fact that that report mentioned that the nature finance is important, the work is still very much dominated by climate finance, and some of us, and particularly Isabella Teixeira and I, who are the part of this task team, is wondering where the nature finance part in that work. So that is actually one of the motivation why the people talk about the climate finance. We need to have a focus also on the nature finance. So that was the initial motivation. Then we, through the way, we came to know that the champions, climate champions, are also publishing the paper for nature finance, but very much focusing on the private sector capital, how to get the private sector money into the nature, so that we said, okay, maybe our paper should focus more on the public sector and the policy side. So how that the private sector, public finance can come together and to really accelerate the move towards nature positive economy. So that was a little bit of the history. Then the focus of our new paper, which is actually done by 5 co-authors, me, Isabella Teixeira, but Nafrani Roria, Vera Songwe, and Marie Pangestro. Those 5 women are coming together to really focus on how we could really move forward nature positive economy, but with strong focus of the public finance and policy. So that the reason of that is, may I continue? The reason for that is, I think by now we all know, everybody in this room, we are in the collision course with nature, that our current economic system doesn't really value the natural capital, as already discussed in the last two hours or so. So how we can really change the course so that to transform our economic system, and so that we continue to live in harmony with natural capital or with nature, the planetary Earth system. So that was the motivation, and that's the reason why we focus so much of the system change. And system change needs to be also driven, not just by private sector capital, but also the public capital, public finance, and together with policy. So in our paper, we have a very strong focus of how we can bring the system change to the current economic and financial system, with particular focus on nature, because as the last panel mentioned, that nature has not been really valued rightly in the economic term. Yes, we do appreciate that the nature maybe spiritually, but we haven't really done it economically. And unless we have a opportunity to put monetary value on the natural capital, our economic system will never ever be able to integrate them into the decision making. I know that many of the nature community really doesn't like to hear that putting the monetary value of the nature, but that is a very important step forward for each one of us, even consumer, that then can take informed action, not just on the corporate, not just the investor, but consumer. For instance, I really want to know how much nature that I'm losing when I choose my dinner. So that is a kind of example of, let's put the monetary value on nature, at least the information on the nature, so that then each one of us can make an informed decision. So that to me, it's a real meaning of valuation of natural capital. in the economic thinking. That the true today, I think that TNFD is launching that very important paper that we, the CGC Center for Global Commons, is a knowledge partner of that, because we really do think it's so important to have that kind of framework to put them appreciate the natural capital, but still the people do see it from risk side, how to measure the risk, but we have to change the way, how to appreciate the opportunity as a nature, as an asset. So that's another big important step forward. So with that, I think there is another important work ongoing, this and how to promote the valuation of the natural capital, to account for and value the natural capital. Some of you may think it's a very academic, pedantic exercise, or it's so far away from the real world. No, not really. There are a lot of good real world examples that either at the corporate level or subnational level, how to really value the natural capital, not just risk, but an asset side. So that I think that if we were compile those kind of things together, there should be a good enabler to shift our economic and financial system towards the nature positive.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And precisely on the opportunity side, we hear so much about innovative financial mechanisms. It's talked about constantly. And how do you see innovative financial mechanisms coming in to the speed and scale that's required to address the climate and biodiversity emergency that we're facing? We just heard from Johan Rockström on the planetary boundaries. So how can innovative financial mechanisms be deployed at scale and also get to the most vulnerable people and the indigenous peoples, as our previous colleagues were mentioning?
Well, when I was with the GEF for 8 years, we have done quite a number of so-called innovative financial mechanisms, including debt swap for nature, that and how to take the risk, that and because the GF is a kind of patient, public capital, risk grabber capital, so that how we can really team up with the private sector to de-risk or take risk, or how to finance that the sunk cost. In many cases, it's a capacity building. It's basically how to fill the weakest link of this multi-stakeholder coalition. So there are a tremendous number of so-called innovative financing mechanism. And we have done, when I was with the Jeff, we already have done for a decade or so. Challenge is that each one of those financial products, it's so labor intensive and it costs a lot in terms of our own capital, I mean, the human capital. So because each one of the product needs a lot of tailoring things. So I was really wondering, can we really, those kind of innovative financing can really do add up to the big system change? So while I think it's important for us to continue to innovate those innovative financial mechanisms, I think we have to take the very much systemic, sector-wide systemic view, how those innovative products can really change the system we are now facing. That maybe I already mentioned that the TNFD, and also that the natural capital accounting, these are backbone of the system change. But maybe that while doing this innovative financing mechanism, we can also take a little bit more systemic, the holistic, sector-wide approach. I think that the previous maybe panel talk a little bit about the food, because we all know that food agriculture is the major threat to the biodiversity and nature. So when you do this, a food system, that you have to really take this food system approach, how you can really address the nature loss. It's not just the conservation, it's more like how to disincentivize that the bad act from food production. So that let's think about how you can take that food system approach when you address that issue. So that then when we talk about palm oil was another topic that the previous the panel doing. So sometimes we have to take this value chain, supply chain approach to really bring every stakeholder from smallholder farmers through to the consumers in Europe, that US and Japan, but also China and India, it's a big consumer of the palm oil. So how we can really bring those people together and how the finance can address the weakest link of this multi-stakeholder coalition. So these are maybe two clear examples of what do I mean by system approach, a sector-wide, a value chain-wide approach. Another system change approach is, I think you may be very familiar with the JET-P for the just energy transition partnership. It's more like on how to support transition strategy of each of the country. I think we should be able to think about JET-P for nature. So how you can really support country effort to make a transition to appreciate the nature and stop the loss of the nature. So we need a government or sub-government really to take the ownership of about transition strategy, because once the government is in the driver's seat, they should be able to bring those different financial sources together, starting with the MDBs, but also bilateral official funding and commercial funding, the philanthropy together. So you can create a kind of transition strategy towards nature positive. So that is another maybe very good way of thinking about system change or sector-wide approach. So my point is that, yes, those innovative financial mechanism is so exciting, but let's be very clear that if each of them do really adapt to change the system, I think it's not good enough to do just the green thing. We really have to think how we can penalize the brown thing so that we can continuously move towards green, and we need to take the system change approach towards that.
Thank you so much for that closing that you're providing. It's very powerful call to action to policymakers to really step up on the penalizing, on the regulatory mechanism, but also to seize that opportunity and facilitate the action and the innovative financial mechanisms. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Naoko. And thanks to you all. I'll pass back to you, Mel, on the closing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renee and Dr. Naoko. So as we come to the end of our conversation, we think back to where we started and we really anchored ourselves in the science and recognizing that we need to address climate and nature goals together. And we've laid out and explored the different roles that finance and public and private finance can play in delivering solutions. We've also heard some of the barriers and some of where that flow is not yet reaching where it should. Finally, I just wanted to think about, as we head out today, what can we focus on? And we want to ask you to really take to heart the calls to action from the report. We're going to pop them up on the slide for you and encourage you to scan the QR code, download the report. And as you go out, if you can think about these 6 actions that private finance actors can take. Supporting high integrity, science-based target setting and disclosure frameworks, integrating the adaptation and resilience into strategies in both business and investment, using the high quality data and analytics and sharing that, scaling catalytic initiatives that can accelerate nature positive business models, working with governments, as we've heard, development banks, institutions, philanthropies, and finally, really going out and sharing those best practices, sharing the lessons learned, where things aren't working, and really celebrating the success stories where they are. So we'll close with that today. And just a huge thank you for joining us on a wet Monday morning. I hope the conversation has been inspiring and enriching. We look forward to seeing you through the week. Thank you.